A struggling rancher bought a pregnant young settler widow and her 7-year-old daughter at auction. What he did next shocked the whole town. Eli Jameson stood apart, his shadow long and bent by the angle of the sun, arms crossed over his chest, hat brim low. He hadn't planned on riding into town that day. He hadn't planned anything, not for years, not since the drought took the cattle, and his wife followed soon after, leaving behind only silence and cracked leather-bound Bibles. But the wheel on his wagon had buckled a mile out, and fate, mean old woman that she was, led him to the square just as the auctioneer lifted his voice over the crowd like a preacher calling sinners forward. And there she stood, the girl. She couldn't have been more than 19, worn thin, as if life had wrung her out early, but there was a straightness to her back that dared the world not to pity her. A faded dress hung loose over her swollen belly. One hand pressed lightly to the curve like she didn't trust it to stay. The other hand held the fingers of a little girl beside her, no more than 7, silent as a church pew, eyes wide and green and unblinking. This one settler stock, the auctioneer called, trying to force cheer into the shame. Husband passed not long ago. Bit of situation, but she's healthy, quiet, comes with the child, well-mannered, no debts. No one moved. Not at first. Women in bonnets looked away, murmuring behind gloved hands. Men nudged each other, but kept their boots planted. No one wanted the burden, the talk, the trouble. A widow with another man's baby. A child already walking and watching. There were easier ways to get help on a homestead. The girl flinched as a coin was flicked lazily into the dirt nearby. Mockery, not offer. Eli did not think. His boots shifted forward before he understood why, dust lifting in little puffs beneath him. The widow's eyes darted up, gray-blue, cloud-heavy, startled but not hopeful. He stopped beside the platform, pulled off his hat. "I'll take him," he said. The auctioneer blinked. "You sure about that, Jameson?" Eli nodded once, pulled a folded packet of bills from his coat, and handed it over. Not a fortune. Not near enough to weigh the shame being carried by the woman's thin shoulders, but was quiet and clean and final. "Name?" the auctioneer asked her. She hesitated. Then softly, "Does it matter?" The man shrugged, pocketed the bills. "Guess not." The little girl glanced between them. She looked more like a fawn than a child, nervous, thin, dark hair tangled down her back. But there was no fear in her, only observation. She studied Eli the way wild things do, measuring threat and safety in a single glance. Eli turned. "Come on." The woman didn't thank him, didn't smile, just stepped off the platform and followed, one hand on her belly, the other holding tight to her daughter. They passed through the town like ghosts, present but untouched. A woman snapped her parasol closed with a click of judgment. A store clerk turned a sign to closed, though it was not yet noon. Even the sheriff, leaning against his office door, gave Eli a long look as they passed. "You got a reputation for loneliness, Jameson," he called. "Don't add foolish to it." Eli said nothing. Foolishness didn't bother him, nor did loneliness. At the edge of town, his horse stood saddled, tethered to a crooked hitching post. He lifted the little girl onto the saddle, without asking, and she didn't flinch. She simply clung to the pommel, and looked back at the town with a stare far too old for her size. The woman climbed up behind her, moving slowly, one hand braced on the saddle horn, the other pressed to her belly again. Eli walked beside them, reins in hand, boots kicking up dust as the sky dimmed behind them. Storm clouds gathered low on the horizon, rolling in like judgment, but the wind held off, for now. They rode in silence. A hush spread wide across the prairie, broken only by the rhythmic creak of saddle leather and the occasional call of a distant crow. Time stretched, slow and long, like a breath held too long in the chest. By the time they reached his ranch, a plain house with a sloping roof and a barn in need of mending, the light had softened. Shadows fell like blankets across the ground. He helped the girl down, then the woman, saying nothing. She stood in front of the house for a long moment, looking at it like a test she hadn't studied for. She did not weep, she did not speak, but her hand dropped slowly from her belly, and for the first time she seemed to stand lighter. "I'll sleep in the barn," Eli said, voice low, almost apologetic. "You take the house." She shook her head. "We'll take the floor." "You'll take the bed," he said, and turned toward the barn. The girl's voice, soft and surprising, followed him like a tether. "Are there horses?" "One," he replied, pausing. "A good one." "Does he like children?" Eli glanced back. He's still deciding. That night, the storm came at last. Rain drummed steady against the tin roof, a lullaby with teeth. Inside the house, the woman lay curled on one side of the bed, the girl nestled into the crook of her knees. In the barn, Eli lay on hay that smelled of summer long gone, staring at the rafters while the wind whispered stories he didn't want to remember. No names had been exchanged, no promises made, but something had shifted, not enough to call hope, but enough to call the beginning of something different. And somewhere in the dark, that small, carved place inside him that had long gone cold stirred, like a coal under ash, not yet flame but no longer dead. Rain came down in long, silver ribbons of night. They crossed the threshold of Eli's cabin, washing the land clean with a quiet insistence. The porch creaked beneath their steps, and water traced lazy lines down the window panes like fingers seeking warmth. Inside, the hearth sat cold. Dust lay settled on the shelves, undisturbed by hand for months. The woman entered first, her skirts damp at the hem, her shoulders stiff. She didn't ask whose house it was. She seemed to understand. The little girl followed, trailing the scent of rain and soil, her small boots leaving shy prints on the wood floor. Eli stood just inside the doorway for a long moment, water dripping from the brim of his hat. Then he hung his coat on the nail by the door, lit the lantern, and let its warm glow push back the shadows. The flame flickered, caught a glimpse of something gentle in the girl's face, something tired but unbroken in her mother's. "The bed's back there," he said, nodding toward the room on the right. "Clean sheets." The woman nodded once. Her eyes said thank you, but her mouth didn't risk it. He watched as she led the child toward the room, their footsteps soft as if afraid to disturb something sacred. The door clicked shut behind them. Eli set about lighting the stove. It took coaxing, 2 splinters and a matchstick miracle, but flame came at last. He boiled coffee out of habit, though it was near midnight, and stood by the window sipping it, watching rain pool in the yard like forgotten sorrow. The silence was not empty. It was the full kind, the kind that held breath and story, the kind that hummed. The days that followed passed slow and muted. She never gave her name, and he never asked. It was as though naming things might break the fragile balance between them, like speaking too loudly in a forest where deer sleep. She moved through the house like she was renting air, not taking it. The child, May, as he'd overheard one morning, was quieter still. She explored with her eyes, not her hands, watched the world as though waiting for it to shift beneath her feet. Eli rose before dawn, worked the land, fixed what had long sat broken. Fences, tools, hinges. He hadn't had reason before. Now, with 2 new hearts beating under his roof, he found himself reaching for repairs he once left undone. She cooked. Not much. There wasn't much to make, but she made do. Cornbread, stew. Once, a pie from shriveled apples she found in the back pantry. She left no mess. Washed every dish. Folded his shirts tighter than he ever did. They rarely spoke, but in the quiet, something softened. May followed him to the barn one morning. Didn't ask. Just showed up in the doorway, fingers wrapped around the frame. He glanced at her, nodded once, and kept brushing the mare. She mimicked him, picked up a brush, copied the motion. The mare didn't flinch. Horses knew grief, and they knew gentleness. The girl was both. Later that day, her mother stood at the stove, one hand resting on the small of her back. Eli came in, mud on his boots, and she turned slightly, offered him a bowl without speaking. Their eyes met just for a moment. It was not warmth, not yet, but it was no longer wariness. The town, of course, did not stay silent. By the end of the week, Mrs. Talbot came riding up in her buggy with a basket of stale bread and judgment. She didn't cross the threshold, just called out, her voice bright and sharp as a church bell. "Mr. Jameson, I do hope you're being careful. A man in your position. Such charity can be misunderstood. Eli met her gaze on the porch, arms folded. A roof and a meal ain't charity. Still, that girl's not your responsibility. Folks are asking questions. Then let 'em. Mrs. Talbot sniffed, dropped the basket with a forced smile, and turned the buggy back toward town. The woman watched from the window, said nothing. That evening, she mended his work shirt. Eli found it folded at the edge of the table, the tears stitched so neatly it seemed new again. He stared at it a long time before putting it on. Later, as dusk fell and the house settled into that warm quiet between supper and sleep, he found her outside hanging laundry, even though the ground was still damp from morning rain. Her belly stretched tight beneath her dress, and she moved slow. Too slow. You should be resting. She didn't look at him. I've rested enough. You'll wear yourself thin. She turned, finally meeting his eyes. What's left of me isn't yours to worry over. Eli nodded. I'm not worrying. She looked at him a moment longer, then hung the last sheet and went inside. That night, May laughed for the first time. It came like a crack of lightning across calm skies, startling and sharp. She'd found a stray chicken that had wandered into the yard and was chasing it barefoot, giggling breathlessly as it darted and dodged. Eli stood on the porch, watching. The woman stepped out beside him, arms folded against the chill. She hasn't laughed in months, she murmured, barely above the wind. Eli nodded. It's a good sound. The woman tilted her head slightly, studying him. You always as quiet. Mostly. She nodded once. Good. That was all. But something in the air changed after that. May began to speak, slowly. Ask questions. Brought Eli wildflowers she'd picked by the creek. He didn't know how to answer half of what she asked, but he listened. That seemed to be enough. One night, the woman placed a hand on the kitchen table, fingers trembling just slightly. We can leave soon. Once I've worked enough to earn back what you spent. Eli didn't look up. Wasn't alone. Her jaw tightened. Still, I don't want to stay where I'm not welcome. He finally met her gaze. You're not unwelcome. She studied him like she didn't believe it. Then, softly, why did you do it? That day. Eli looked past her to the window, where May was crouched by the fire, humming to herself while drawing horses in the soot with her fingertip. Seemed like the only decent thing left to do. She swallowed, turned away. Outside, the wind had shifted. Not warm, not yet, but no longer cold. The cabin was still filled with silence, but now it hummed with something else, too. Not sorrow, not quite. Something quieter. Waiting. And in that hush, something began to grow, small, unnoticed, like the first green shoot beneath snow. Not love, not yet, but the space where love could live if given time. Just before bed, Eli found the girls drawing near the hearth. It was a horse, yes, but beside it stood a figure with a crooked hat and kind eyes. She had scratched one word beneath it in soft, crooked letters. Safe. Eli folded the drawing and tucked it into his coat pocket, and for the first time in years, he slept easy. The fire came sudden in the night, not from the sky, but from the ridge, orange light licking the horizon like the devil's tongue. Eli saw it first from the barn loft, where he'd been oiling a rusted hinge in the dark, more out of habit than need. At first he thought it was lightning, until the glow kept pulsing, too steady, too low, too hungry. He climbed down fast, boots thudding against the ladder rungs, and burst through the barn doors. The cabin's windows flickered with the reflected blaze. He was already grabbing his saddle before the front door opened, and she stepped out, hair loose, one hand braced on her belly. What is it? She asked. Barn fire. Looks like Johnson's place. Do you need? He was already mounting. Stay inside. Keep the girl close. She didn't argue, just nodded and disappeared back into the shadows of the house. The mare ran hard through the night, hooves pounding dirt that felt suddenly too dry, too ready to catch. Smoke hung low, thick and acrid, and Eli tied a kerchief over his mouth as he rode. At the ridge, half the town had gathered, buckets moving in panic chains, shouts slicing the air. Johnson's barn was half gone already, timber crashing into flame, the air hot as a forge. Eli joined the line, without a word. Water, soot, more water. He didn't stop until the last embers hissed and died, until ash took the place of structure. It was near dawn when he turned his mare homeward, face streaked in black, shirt clinging to his back. The cabin was dark when he returned, but she was awake, sitting by the coal hearth, wrapped in a quilt, eyes heavy with waiting. She rose when he entered, said nothing, just fetched a basin and cloth. He sat, too tired to argue. She knelt beside him and cleaned the soot from his face in silence. Her hands were steady, movements careful, reverent. Her fingers brushed aside his jaw, lingered, not in affection, but in quiet thanks. Something unspoken passed between them, heavy as smoke. "They save it?" she asked finally. "No." A beat passed. "No one hurt?" "No one but the horse." She pressed the cloth harder against the skin, eyes tight. "We had a barn fire once," she said after a while. "Back before he died. It started from a lantern kicked over during an argument." He looked at her. She did not flinch. "I told him it was too late to argue," she continued, voice thin. "He'd been drunk. The barn went up in minutes. We lost our mule. Afterward, he blamed me for not yelling louder. Eli didn't ask who he was. He didn't need to. Sometimes I wonder if the baby felt that heat from inside me," she whispered, looking down at her belly. "If it changed him." "Or her," Eli said gently. She gave a small, hollow laugh. "Or her." The next few days passed in gray silence. The fire had shaken the town more than expected. Maybe because it wasn't the first this year. Or maybe because it had come so close to homes, to people. Either way, folks grew uneasy, suspicious, and suspicion has a way of sniffing out easy targets. By week's end, word was floating down Main Street like smoke. That girl's bad luck. First her husband, now this fire. Mark my words, wherever she goes, trouble follows. Eli heard at the general store, spoken behind the flour barrels in whispers meant to travel. He let it pass. Words couldn't be punched, and gossip always burned out faster than kindling when left alone. But he noticed her shoulders tightening whenever she rode into town with May. How she wrapped her shawl tighter. How her eyes flicked to the faces of strangers and found no welcome. That Sunday, the preacher gave a sermon on consequence. Sometimes the Lord sends the storms to remind us of what needs cleansing. His gaze never drifted directly to her, but the aim was clear. After church, May tugged Eli's sleeve. "Why don't people smile at Mama?" He didn't know how to answer that. Back at the ranch, life pressed on. May had begun to shadow Eli daily, asking endless questions about horses, weather, even fence posts. She carved little animals out of scraps of wood, leaving them on the porch rail like offerings. Once, she gave him a rabbit with lopsided ears. "It's not perfect," she said, looking down. He turned it over in his callous hand. "Neither is the real thing. The woman, still nameless to him, though he begun to think of her in the shape of strength, started planting herbs in the back, old-world remedies she murmured about under her breath. Her steps grew heavier with the child nearing birth, but she refused to rest long. One evening, as they shelled beans together on the porch, she asked, "Why haven't you sent us away?" Eli didn't look up. "Why would I?" "Because I see the way the town looks at me. At her, like we're something foul they stepped in." He considered that. "You're not here for them," he said finally. "You're here for you." Her lips parted slightly, as if to speak, but no sound came. She turned back to the bowl. "I thought I'd stop believing in decency," she murmured after a while. "But you just keep showing up with it, like it's nothing." "It's not nothing," Eli said. "It's just quiet." That night, thunder rolled in the distance, but no rain followed. Just heat. Crickets went silent. Even the wind held its breath. Near midnight, a cry broke the hushed maze. Eli was out of bed before the second syllable left her mouth, crossing the yard to the cabin, rifle in hand. The girl stood in the doorway, white-faced, pointing toward the barn. "There was a man," she whispered, "by the horses." The woman stepped out behind her, eyes wide, belly taut beneath her nightgown. "What kind of man?" "I don't know. Big. He saw me and ran." Eli swept the barn, found nothing but a broken latch on the far stall and a cigarette still smoldering in the dirt. He stayed up the rest of the night, posted on the porch with his rifle across his lap. By morning, May wouldn't leave her mother's side. That evening, the sheriff rode in, asked if Eli had seen anything. Rumors of a drifter, a man asking about a young widow. The kind of man who doesn't take no for an answer. Eli thanked him, closed the door, and double-bolted it. The woman stood nearby, arms wrapped around her middle. "I know who it is," she said. He waited. "My husband's brother, Jacob. He said if Tom ever died, I was his to claim." Said it with a smile like it was funny. Eli's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. "He know where you are?" "Maybe. I don't know. He's clever, patient. Then we'll be ready." She looked at him, tired and brave. "You shouldn't have to protect us." "I'm not doing it because I have to." Her mouth trembled, but she didn't cry. Later, as dust bled across the land and the lantern burned low, Eli caught sight of her watching him with something raw in her eyes, like gratitude wrapped in guilt. "You've given us more than most ever would," she said softly. "I haven't given you anything," he replied. "Just made space." Sometimes space is everything. May fell asleep by the fire that night, a worn blanket tucked around her. Eli carried her to the small bed in the other room, careful not to wake her. When he turned back, the woman stood in the doorway, watching. "Do you want to know my name?" she asked. Eli nodded. "Florence." He repeated it once, let it sit on his tongue. "Florence," he said again, and something in her face changed, like a door inside her creaked open. She stepped forward then. "Not close, but closer. You remind me of the man I hoped my husband would become," she whispered. Eli said nothing. They stood there, two people weathered by the same wind, held together by quiet and hardship, by the thin threads of decency and choice. Outside, the night wrapped the house in stillness, and no fire had come too close, and danger prowled just beyond knowing. For now, the cabin hummed with something stronger than fear, the promise of staying, the ache of almost. Sunday came with sharp sun and brittle sky, the kind that made every shadow feel longer than it was. Eli brushed the mare early, saddled the wagon with quiet hands. Florence stood in the doorway of the cabin. May tucked into her skirt a hand-me-down ribbon tied crooked in the girl's hair. She wore the blue shawl Eli had left on the bedpost, and though it was thin at the edges, it softened her shoulders, made her look less like a woman fighting the world and more like one ready to face it. "You don't have to come," he said, adjusting the reins. Florence lifted her chin. "I do." They rode in silence, the road into Dry Creek lined with brittle stalks and tired fence posts. The town came into view like a wound half-healed. Wooden fronts, dust in the corners, the church steeple trying to stand straight against the wind. May sat between them, hands in her lap, eyes on the passing trees. She didn't fidget or speak. She simply watched, the way children do when they know something's about to shift. The wagon wheels creaked as they pulled up beside the church. People had already begun to gather, bonnets fluttering, boots stomping dust from their soles. The bell hadn't rung yet, but the verdict had already begun its whispering. One by one, heads turned. First the men, tilting their hats low, not out of courtesy but out of discomfort. Then the women, clutching their Bibles a little tighter, eyes narrowing beneath brows like drawn curtains. Florence stepped down without waiting for Eli's help. May followed, holding her mother's hand like a tether to courage. They walked up the steps together, their footsteps unhurried, unashamed. And though no one stepped aside, the door stayed open. Inside, the pews were worn, the air still. Hymnals lined up like soldiers waiting for orders. They found a seat near the back, and though no one said aloud, a small space opened around them, like folks were afraid of catching some unnamed sorrow. The sermon passed in a haze of scripture and sweat. Preacher Wallace spoke on sin, on cleansing, on the path back to the fold. His eyes skimmed past Florence more than once, never landing but always brushing, like a warning. After the final hymn, the crowd spilled out into the square like a river. That's when it began in earnest. "She's bold, showing up here. Poor child, dragged along like that. Jameson's always been strange. This just confirms it. Eli heard it all, didn't flinch, just adjusted his hat, and walked beside them as they returned to the wagon. Near the general store, Mrs. Talbot caught up to them, her lips thin as sewing thread. "Mr. Jameson, I wonder if you'd speak with me a moment. In private." He didn't stop. "Anything you've got to say, you can say plain." Mrs. Talbot glanced at Florence, then leaned in. "You're a respected man. No one faults you for kindness. But folks talk. Bringing her in, it looks like something else." Eli turned slowly to face her. "Let them talk. She's not your wife. She's not even your kin. She's under my roof. That's enough." Mrs. Talbot flushed, taken aback. "You'll ruin your reputation." Eli looked down at May, who was clutching his sleeve now, her eyes wide. He knelt to her level. "You hungry, May?" She nodded. "Let's go home." They climbed into the wagon. As Eli took the reins, Florence touched his arm lightly. "You didn't have to defend me." "Yes, I did." Back at the ranch, the silence returned, but not the heavy kind. This one was softer, wrapped in warmth and wood smoke. May ran toward the barn to check on the hen she'd been nursing back to health, and Florence stood for a long time on the porch before speaking. "I haven't been at church since Tom died," she said. "Figured God had already made up his mind about me." Eli leaned against the post. "Maybe God's quieter than people. Maybe he listens more." She smiled, just barely. "Then he heard a lot today." That week, Eli went to town alone for supplies. He noticed how the store clerk hesitated before bagging the flour, how the blacksmith offered a nod but no words. Even the boys at the saloon porch paused mid-game to stare. Eli let it pass. He bought new boots for May, soft leather, small and strong. He bought a comb for Florence, and a bar of lavender soap he knew she wouldn't ask for but might use. He bought extra nails, too, because fixing things, it seemed, was becoming a habit. When he returned, Florence met him in the yard, arms dusted with flour. She took the bags without speaking, but lingered near the wagon, her gaze thoughtful. "I used to think surviving was enough," she said quietly. "Just getting through the day. But lately I've been wondering if there's more." "There is," Eli said. She looked up. "How do you know?" "Because the house doesn't feel empty anymore." Her eyes glistened then, but she turned away before tears could betray her. Later that evening, May read aloud from a book Eli had brought, a story about horses and hidden valleys. Her voice rose and dipped like creek water. Florence sat at the table, mending one of Eli's old shirts, her needle threading rhythm into the silence. As dusk settled, there came a knock at the door. Eli opened it to find Preacher Wallace on the porch, hat in hand. "Evening," the preacher said. "Thought I'd stop by." Eli stepped aside but didn't invite him in. The preacher cleared his throat. "Some folks feel concerned about appearances." "I'm not." "Well," the preacher said carefully, "I come not to scold but to offer guidance. The widow, she might find peace through formal repentance. Publicly, a confession can be cleansing." Eli's jaw twitched. "She has nothing to confess," he said. "She's not a criminal. She's a mother. She's endured more than most ever will." The preacher shifted. "Still, it would help folks feel less troubled." Eli didn't answer, just stared until the preacher, clearly unwelcome, tipped his hat and made his retreat. When he closed the door, Florence was standing there, her face unreadable. "I heard," she said. "I figured." She came closer. "Do you believe him?" "No. But you believe me?" Eli nodded. "I believe what I see." "And what you see?" He looked at her, really looked, at the lines carved by worry, the hands calloused by labor, the life still blooming under her ribs despite everything. "I see a woman still standing. That counts for more than anything else." That night, as the moon rose and the prairie exhaled its long breath, Eli found a small wood carving May had left beside his bed, a horse and two people beside it. The figures were rough but familiar. One wore a crooked hat, the other held a child's hand. He turned it over in his palm, then placed it carefully on the shelf above his bed. Outside, wind moved through the grass like whispered approval, and inside the house, For the first time, the three of them slept beneath the same roof, not as strangers bound by debt or need, but as something still unnamed, still forming, but steady as morning light. The wind turned that morning, sudden and sharp, lifting dust into spirals and making the trees bow low. Crows shrieked overhead, unsettled by something only they seemed to understand. The house, once humming with the quiet rhythm of three people learning to live together, now felt brittle. Like it, too, held its breath. Eli noticed the tracks before he saw the rider. Hoof prints not made by his mare or the sheriff's gelding, too fresh, too deep. He followed them with quiet frown, eyes narrowing. They led down the ridge trail, across the creek bed, and vanished behind a stand of cottonwoods. He didn't like it. At the cabin, Florence stood on the porch, rubbing her lower back, belly heavier now, face drawn but steady. May was in the yard, placing small stones in circles, whispering names to each one. "There's a rider out," Eli said. Florence turned slowly. "Describe him." "I haven't seen him, but his horse carries weight." She went still. Her hands fell to her sides. "I think it's Jacob." Eli didn't ask how she knew. Her voice had changed, gone flat, hollow, the way it had once been when she first arrived, dust-slicked and unspeaking. He used to say that everything Tom owned would fall to him eventually. Said he'd take what was owed, even me. Eli stepped closer. "He won't take anything." "You don't know him." "No, but I know you." That quiet exchange, simple and soft, felt heavier than most shouted oaths. And still the wind blew, dry and restless. By afternoon, the rider appeared, a silhouette against the sun, slow but certain, coming down the trail like a man who already owned the land he crossed. He didn't dismount, just sat on a black horse, thick with lather, and stared at the cabin like it had offended him by existing. "Jacob," Florence said softly, her fingers curling around the porch rail. "He always makes sure you see him coming." Eli stepped off the porch and walked toward the gate. He didn't carry his rifle, but his hands were not empty. He held himself like a man with purpose, not threat, and that was worse somehow. Calmer. The rider pulled up at the fence and grinned down at him. Jacob was younger than Eli expected, but his eyes were old in the wrong ways, mean, watchful, slick with the certainty of a man who'd been told, yes, too many times and never learned what it meant to earn a thing. "Well now," he drawled, "you must be the one." Eli didn't answer. Jacob leaned forward. "Florence's new savior. Heard you bought her outright. That true?" Eli's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed even. "You have no claim here." Jacob laughed. "A short, sharp thing. You know what she is, right? Broken in property. She ain't yours to keep." "She's not property at all." That made Jacob's eyes narrow. "I got blood right. Her husband, my brother, he and I had an understanding. She goes where the family says. That girl, too. Kin is kin." Eli didn't move. "You're not family. You're a shadow following the fire." Jacob's face shifted, the grin slipping just a little. "You talk like a preacher. You fight like one, too." Eli didn't answer. He didn't need to. Behind him, the screen door creaked. Florence stepped out, arms folded, her face pale but unshaken. "You don't get to show up and make rules," she said, her voice louder than it had been in days. "You think because you were kin to Tom that you owned us. But you never did." Jacob smiled again, cruel and patient. "You carrying his child still?" "I'm carrying my child." "You really think this man's gonna stay once that belly splits, and you're just a girl with two mouths to feed?" Eli stepped forward. "Get off my land." "You gonna make me?" Jacob dismounted in one motion, quick, practiced. He was tall, whip-lean, hands twitching at his sides like they longed for something to break. He stepped past the gate, boots crunching dry earth. "I could take her right now," he said softly. "Take the girl, too. You think the law would stop me? You think this town cares?" "I care," Eli said. "That's enough." Jacob swung first. A quick, hard jab meant to provoke more than injure. It clipped Eli's jaw, sent his head jerking sideways. Blood touched his tongue. He didn't stagger, just stood there. "That all you got?" Eli asked, voice low. Jacob frowned. Eli moved. The punch he threw was deliberate, clean, aimed not at the jaw but the center of the chest. Jacob gasped, stumbled back, breath knocked from him. Eli didn't follow it up. He didn't need to. He just stood the way he always did, like a wall the wind couldn't move. Jacob recovered, face twisted. You think you won something here? No, Eli said, but I've kept what matters. The silence after that was deep, thicker than rage, heavier than pride. Florence had stepped off the porch now, her feet bare, her face calm. Leave, Jacob, she said. Leave and don't come back. There's nothing for you here. You think this man will love you? Jacob spat. You're ruined. That kid's a burden. Florence looked at him, and for the first time, there was no fear, only pity. She's not a burden. She's my beginning. Jacob stared at her, then at Eli, and then with a sneer, he turned back toward his horse. This town's stupid, letting a whore and a fool rewrite the rules. Eli didn't flinch. Dry Creek doesn't belong to you. Jacob mounted, spat in the dust, and rode off without looking back. The wind died with him. Later, May climbed into Eli's lap by the fire, a blanket around her shoulders. She looked up at him with quiet seriousness. Were you scared? She asked. No, not even a little? He smiled. Maybe a little. Florence sat across from them, her hands folded over her belly. The fire cast her in soft light, made her look both older and newer somehow, as if she had shed the past and stood up clean in its place. She whispered, I didn't think anyone would ever stand for me. Not really. I didn't stand for you, Eli said gently. I stood with you. She blinked quickly, looked down. That night, the house didn't hum with silence. It hummed with something fuller, something earned, through splinters, through fear, through defiance. There was no declaration, no kiss. But when Eli set a second cup of coffee beside her in the morning, and she took it without hesitation, it felt like more than enough. Outside, the porch creaked beneath new weight. Safety, belonging, the weight of a name finally said aloud and believed. The wind had shifted again, but this time it was warm, like spring coming early. In the stillness that followed, May drew a picture by the hearth. A tall man, a woman with sunlight in her hair, a little girl between them, holding both their hands. And in the bottom corner, in crooked letters, she wrote a single word. Home. Somewhere in the world, people would still talk. But on this land, beneath this roof, the only voice that mattered was the one that had chosen to stay. And maybe that's all life ever needs. Not perfection, not permission, but a hand offered, a place made, and someone who says, I see you and I won't look away. In the end, it wasn't about what Eli did to shock the town. It was what he did after. When no one was watching, he stayed.